Sarah, you need to see this. My voice cracked as I held the old Leica camera in my trembling hands. My sister looked up from the dusty photo albums scattered across our grandfather's attic floor, her eyes immediately drawn to the weight in my expression. The silence that followed felt heavy, like the air before a thunderstorm. Have you ever found something that instantly made your skin crawl, even though you couldn't explain why? Something that seemed innocent, but felt wrong in every fiber of your being? Tell me in the comments if you've ever experienced that bone-deep certainty that you've stumbled upon something you were never meant to find. And please, subscribe, because what I discovered in that camera changed everything I thought I knew about my family. It was 3 days after Grandpa Edwin's funeral. The house still smelled like his pipe tobacco and old leather, scents that had comforted me as a child, but now felt like ghosts lingering in every corner. Sarah and I had volunteered to sort through his belongings, a task that seemed straightforward until we climbed those creaking stairs to the attic. The camera wasn't hidden exactly. It sat on his old wooden desk, positioned deliberately next to a stack of yellowed newspapers from 1987 and a small, leather-bound journal I didn't recognize. The Leica was beautiful, vintage, well-maintained, with that satisfying weight that only quality craftsmanship can provide. Grandpa had been a photographer in his younger years, before marriage and responsibility had relegated his passion to weekend hobby status. He always said he'd teach me to use the old cameras someday, I whispered, running my fingers along the smooth metal body. The leather grip was worn soft from decades of use, molded to fit hands that would never hold it again. Sarah moved closer, her footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust coating the wooden floor. Maybe we should take it to get developed, she suggested, pointing to the small window on the back that indicated film was still loaded inside. He probably forgot about whatever pictures are in there. But as I lifted the camera to examine it more closely, something felt different. The weight was wrong. Not just the expected heft of the camera body, but something else. Something that made my stomach turn without any logical reason. I should have put it down right then. I should have suggested we tackle the boxes of Christmas ornaments instead, or sort through his collection of National Geographic magazines. But curiosity has always been my weakness, and the camera seemed to pulse with secrets in my hands. "Look at this," I said, discovering a small compartment I'd never noticed before. Hidden beneath the main body was a tiny space, just large enough for a rolled piece of paper. My fingers fumbled with the mechanism until it clicked open. Inside was a single photograph, different from any family photo I'd ever seen. It was small, maybe 3 inches square, with that distinctive sepia tone of much older film. The edges were worn, as if it had been handled repeatedly, and there was something written on the back in Grandpa's careful handwriting. Sarah leaned in as I turned the photo over. The script was faded but legible. "The last one who knew, October 15th, 1963. "What do you think that means?" she asked, but I was already turning the photo back to its front side. What I saw in that image made my blood run cold. It was a picture of our grandmother, not the gentle woman we'd known and loved, but a younger version, maybe in her early 30s. She was standing in what looked like the kitchen of a house I didn't recognize, but that wasn't what made my hands shake. Behind her, barely visible in the shadows of the doorway, was a figure I couldn't quite make out. Someone who shouldn't have been there. Someone who made every instinct I had scream that this photograph was hiding something terrible. And that's when I noticed the date on the back wasn't just any date. It was exactly 1 week before our father was born. "This doesn't make sense," Sarah whispered, taking the photograph from my numb fingers. Her face had gone pale in the dim attic light, and I watched her eyes dart between the image and the date written in Grandpa's unmistakable handwriting. The floorboards creaked beneath us, as if the old house itself was shifting under the weight of what we'd uncovered. I forced myself to look at the photograph again, this time more carefully. Our grandmother, Patricia, stood by what appeared to be a kitchen sink, her hand resting on her very obviously pregnant belly. She was beautiful, radiant even, with that glow people always talk about expecting mothers having. But her smile seemed forced, and her eyes held something I'd never seen in any other family photograph: fear. "Maybe it's just a neighbor," Sarah suggested, but her voice lacked conviction. "Or a family friend stopping by." I wanted to agree with her. God, how I wanted to believe that simple explanation. But the figure in the shadows wasn't positioned like a casual visitor. They were partially concealed, as if deliberately staying out of clear view. And there was something about their posture, something predatory and wrong that made my skin crawl. "Look at Grandma's face again," I said softly. "Really look at it." Sarah held the photo closer to the single bulb hanging from the attic ceiling. After a long moment, she set it down on the desk with shaking hands. "She's terrified," she breathed. The admission hung between us like a confession. Our grandmother, the woman who had baked us cookies and taught us to embroider, who had seemed unflappable and strong until the cancer took her when we were teenagers, she had been afraid of whoever was lurking in that doorway. I picked up the camera again, my curiosity now mixed with a growing sense of dread. "We need to see what else is on this roll of film," I said, though every rational part of me was screaming to leave well enough alone. "Maybe we shouldn't," Sarah replied, but she was already looking around the attic for something to help us. Some secrets die for a reason. But it was too late for that wisdom. The photograph had already planted its seed of doubt in my mind, and I could feel it growing, spreading its roots through everything I thought I knew about our family history. How many times had I heard the story of my father's birth? How Grandpa had paced the hospital waiting room for 18 hours, smoking pack after pack of cigarettes until the nurse finally announced he had a son. Never once had anyone mentioned another man being present in the days before. I found an old magnifying glass among Grandpa's photography supplies and brought it back to the photograph. Under the enhanced view, details I'd missed became clearer. The kitchen definitely wasn't our grandparents' house. The cabinets were different, painted a pale green that seemed somehow familiar. And Grandma's dress. It was torn at the shoulder, just slightly, as if she'd snagged it on something sharp, or as if someone had grabbed her. "Sarah," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "I think I recognize this kitchen." She moved closer, looking over my shoulder at the magnified image. "What do you mean?" "The cabinets. That specific shade of green. Don't you remember the stories about Great-Aunt Martha's house, the one that burned down in the 70s? Sarah's intake of breath was sharp and sudden. "You think this was taken at Martha's house?" Martha had been Grandpa's sister, a woman I'd only heard about in hushed conversations that stopped whenever Sarah and I entered the room. She'd died in the fire that consumed her home, and the family had always spoken of it as a tragic accident. But now, looking at this photograph taken in what might have been her kitchen, I wondered if there was more to that story. I was about to voice this thought when Sarah grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin hard enough to leave marks. "Look at the window reflection," she said, her voice so quiet I almost didn't hear her. I adjusted the magnifying glass to focus on the kitchen window visible behind our grandmother. At first, I saw only the wavy distortion typical of old glass, but as my eyes adjusted, I could make out shapes in the reflection. There were two figures outside that window. Two people who had been watching our pregnant grandmother from the yard, and one of them was definitely our grandfather. But if Grandpa was outside watching through the window, then who was the shadow figure standing in the doorway behind our grandmother? The magnifying glass slipped from my fingers and clattered onto the wooden desk, the sound echoing through the attic like a gunshot. Sarah and I stared at each other, both of us trying to process what we'd just seen. "That can't be right," Sarah whispered, but she was already reaching for the magnifying glass herself, desperate to prove we'd been wrong. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the sound of our breathing and the occasional creak of the old house settling. Outside, storm clouds were gathering, and the first drops of rain began to tap against the attic window like impatient fingers. I watched Sarah examine the photograph again, her face growing paler with each second. Finally, she set the magnifying glass down and looked at me with eyes full of questions neither of us wanted to ask. "If Grandpa was outside," she said slowly, "then who was inside with her?" The question hung in the air like smoke, poisoning everything around it. I found myself thinking about all the family stories I'd grown up with, all the carefully constructed narratives that suddenly seemed fragile as spider webs. Our father had always been told he looked nothing like either of his parents. It was a family joke, how he'd inherited his dark hair and olive complexion from some distant relative no one could quite identify. But what if it wasn't a distant relative at all? I moved to one of the cardboard boxes we hadn't opened yet and began rifling through its contents. Most of it was the expected detritus of a long life. Old bills, faded receipts, programs from church services. But at the bottom, my fingers found something that made my heart skip. Another photograph. This one was clearer, more recent, taken with better film and better lighting. It showed a family gathering, Christmas by the looks of the decorations, and I recognized most of the faces. There was Grandma Patricia, looking to be in her 60s, standing next to Grandpa Edwin. My father was there too, probably in his 30s, with his arm around our mother. But there was another man in the photograph standing slightly apart from the group. He had dark hair and olive skin, and when I looked at his face, I felt like I was looking into a mirror that showed me what my father might have been if he'd aged differently. "Sarah?" I breathed, holding out the photograph with shaking hands. She took one look at it and sank onto an old trunk, her face going white. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Who is that?" I turned the photograph over, hoping for some clue, some identification that would make sense of what we were seeing. There was no date, no names, just a single line in Grandpa's handwriting. "Some truths are too dangerous to bury." The rain was falling harder now, drumming against the roof with increasing intensity. The sound should have been comforting. I'd always loved thunderstorms, but now it felt ominous, as if nature itself was responding to the secrets we were unearthing. I thought about our father, sleeping peacefully in his house across town, completely unaware that his entire understanding of his identity might be built on a lie. How do you tell someone that the man who raised them, who taught them to ride a bike and helped with homework and walked them down the aisle, might not be their biological father? "We need to see the rest of the film," I said, though the words felt like lead in my mouth. Whatever Grandpa documented, whatever he was trying to preserve or hide, it's all on that roll. Sarah looked at the camera sitting on the desk as if it were a venomous snake. "What if we don't like what we find? What if we need to know anyway?" The question surprised me as it came out of my mouth, but I realized it was true. These weren't just random photographs we'd stumbled upon. They were evidence, carefully preserved by a man who had kept family secrets for decades. Grandpa Edwin had been a meticulous person, organized and thoughtful. He wouldn't have kept these images without a reason. "There's a photo lab downtown that still develops film," Sarah said finally. "The old man who runs it, Mr. Peterson, he's been doing it for 50 years. He's discreet." I nodded, understanding what she wasn't saying. We needed someone who wouldn't ask questions, who wouldn't look too closely at what we were developing, someone who understood that some photographs carried more than just images. As I carefully removed the film from the camera, I noticed something else. A small piece of paper taped inside the camera body, hidden where only someone familiar with the mechanism would find it. With trembling fingers, I peeled it away and unfolded it. It was a page torn from Grandpa's journal, dated just 3 weeks ago, shortly before he died. The handwriting was shakier than usual, the work of a man whose time was running out. "The girls will find the camera after I'm gone. They're smart, just like their grandmother was. Patricia made me promise never to tell, but promises to the dead carry less weight than truth for the living. What happened at Martha's house that night in 1963 wasn't an accident, and the man in the photograph, he's still alive." The page ended there, but at the bottom, in darker ink as if it had been added later, was an address I didn't recognize and a name that made my blood run cold. Vincent Russo, 1247 Elmwood Drive. He knows what really happened to Martha. Sarah's hands were shaking so violently she could barely hold the torn journal page. The name Vincent Russo seemed to burn itself into my vision, and I found myself repeating it silently, testing how it felt in my mind. "We can't actually be considering this," Sarah said, though her voice lacked conviction. "We can't just show up at some stranger's door with a 60-year-old photograph and start asking questions about a dead woman." But even as she spoke, I could see the same desperate curiosity in her eyes that I felt clawing at my chest. The storm outside was growing stronger, lightning illuminating the attic in brief, stark flashes that made the shadows seem to move and breathe around us. I walked to the small attic window and peered out at the darkening sky. "What if it's not a stranger?" I asked quietly. "What if Vincent Russo is the man in the photograph, the one standing in Martha's kitchen while Grandpa watched from outside?" The implications hung in the air between us like a poisonous cloud. If Vincent Russo was still alive, if he was the shadow figure from that terrifying photograph, then he might hold answers to questions we were only beginning to formulate. "Look at this," Sarah said, her voice strange and distant. She was holding another item from the box, a yellowed newspaper clipping that had been folded and refolded so many times the creases had worn through in places. I moved closer to read over her shoulder. The headline made my stomach drop. "Local woman dies in house fire, arson suspected." The article was dated October 22, 1963, exactly 1 week after the photograph we'd found, and the same week our father was born. According to the brief report, Martha Coleman, using her maiden name, I realized, had died when her house on Maple Street caught fire in the early morning hours. Neighbors reported seeing a man fleeing the scene, but police were unable to identify or locate him. "She didn't die accidentally," I whispered, the words feeling foreign and horrible in my mouth. Sarah nodded, her face pale in the dim light. "And whatever happened that night, Grandpa knew about it. He documented it." I thought about the photograph again, about our grandmother's terrified expression and the shadow figure lurking behind her. Had Martha been trying to help her sister-in-law? Had she discovered something that made her dangerous to the wrong person? "We have to develop that film," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "And we have to find Vincent Russo." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, staring at the newspaper clipping as if it might reveal additional secrets. Finally, she looked up at me with an expression I'd seen before. It was the same look she'd had when we were children, and I dared her to jump from the tire swing into the creek. Terrified, but unable to resist the challenge. "The photo lab opens at 8, she said. "But Elmwood Drive, that's only about 20 minutes from here." The suggestion hung between us like a bridge we couldn't uncross once we'd taken that first step. Outside, thunder crashed so loudly the entire house seemed to shudder, and for a moment I imagined I could hear voices in the wind. Grandpa's voice, maybe, or Great-Aunt Martha's, urging us forward or warning us away. I gathered up the photographs and the journal page, slipping them into a manila envelope I found on the desk. The camera felt heavier now, weighted with secrets and possibilities. "If we're going to do this," I said, "we should go tonight, before we lose our nerve." Sarah stood up, brushing dust from her jeans with movements that seemed too deliberate, too controlled. "What if he's dangerous? What if there's a reason this has been kept secret for 60 years? It was a valid question, one I'd been trying not to think about. But looking around the attic, at the careful way Grandpa had preserved these pieces of evidence, I realized something important. Grandpa wasn't afraid of Vincent Russo, I said slowly. If he was, he would have destroyed these photographs, not preserved them. He wanted us to find them. He wanted us to know the truth. The storm seemed to be directly overhead now, lightning and thunder coming almost simultaneously. In the brief illumination, I caught sight of something else on the desk, something I'd somehow missed before. A key. It was old-fashioned, brass, attached to a small tag with an address written in Grandpa's careful script. But it wasn't the Elmwood Drive address. This was somewhere else entirely. "Sarah," I said, my voice barely audible over the storm, "I think I know where we need to go first." She looked at the key in my hands, and I watched her face change as she read the address on the tag. It was 1247 Elmwood Drive, Vincent Russo's address. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. It was the word written beneath the address in red ink, as if it had been added much more recently. Basement. The rain hammered against my car windshield with such intensity that the wipers could barely keep up. Sarah sat in the passenger seat, clutching the manila envelope against her chest like armor, while I navigated the dark streets toward Elmwood Drive. Neither of us had spoken since leaving Grandpa's house, but the silence wasn't empty. It was full of unasked questions and growing dread. "We should have waited until morning," Sarah finally said, as I turned onto a tree-lined street where the old streetlights created pools of yellow light in the darkness. "This feels like something from a horror movie." I wanted to agree with her, wanted to turn around and go home to our respective lives and families. But the key in my pocket seemed to pulse with heat, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were running out of time for something, though I couldn't say what. "Look at the house numbers," I said, slowing down as we entered what appeared to be an older neighborhood. The houses here were substantial but worn, the kind of working-class homes built in the 1940s and 50s that had seen better decades. 12 and 39, 12 and 41, 12 and 45. Sarah counted, her voice getting quieter with each number. There, 12 and 47. The house sat back from the street, partially hidden by overgrown hedges and a massive oak tree that had probably been planted when the neighborhood was new. It was dark, except for a single porch light that cast an eerie glow over the front steps. I parked across the street, and we sat there for several minutes, watching the house as if it might reveal its secrets from the outside. It looked ordinary. White siding that needed painting, a small front porch, shutters that had seen better days. Nothing about it screamed danger or family secrets, but somehow that made it more unsettling. "The basement," Sarah whispered, and I knew she was thinking the same thing I was. What kind of secrets required a key to a basement? A light came on in one of the upper windows, and we both ducked instinctively, though we were far enough away that we couldn't possibly have been seen. A shadow moved across the curtains. Someone was home. "He's real," I breathed. "Vincent Russo is real, and he's alive, and he's right there." The reality of it hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just an old photograph anymore, or a mysterious name in a journal. Vincent Russo was a living person, probably in his 80s now, who had been present during whatever happened to our grandmother and great-aunt Martha in 1963. My phone buzzed with a text message, making both of us jump. It was from my husband. "Hey, babe, storm's getting bad. You and Sarah okay at your grandpa's house?" I stared at the message, trying to remember what normal life felt like. Just a few hours ago, my biggest concern had been whether to keep Grandpa's collection of National Geographic magazines. Now, I was sitting outside a stranger's house with a key that might unlock 60 years of family secrets. "We should knock on the door," Sarah said suddenly. "Just introduce ourselves. Say we're Edwin Coleman's granddaughters, and we found some old photographs we thought he might be interested in seeing." It was a reasonable plan, logical and straightforward. But something about the house made my skin crawl, and I found myself thinking about Great-Aunt Martha, who had died in a fire exactly 1 week after that terrifying photograph was taken. "What if he recognizes us?" I asked. "What if he knows who we are? And that's not a good thing." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering this. Finally, she reached into the envelope and pulled out the Christmas photograph, the one that showed the man who looked so much like our father. "Maybe we don't go in through the front door," she said slowly. "Maybe we use the key first, see what's in the basement, get some answers before we confront him." The suggestion should have horrified me. Breaking and entering, trespassing, possibly putting ourselves in danger. It went against everything I'd been taught about safety and common sense. But looking at that photograph, at the face that could have been our father's twin, I felt a desperate need to know the truth that overrode every rational objection. "The basement entrance is probably around back," I said, surprised by my own words. "Most houses this age have exterior basement access." We sat there for another few minutes watching the house. The upstairs light went out and the building settled back into darkness except for the lonely porch light. The storm was beginning to pass, the rain lessening to a steady patter instead of the earlier downpour. Finally, I turned off the car engine. "If we're going to do this," I said, "we do it quickly. We go in, we look around, we get out, and if anything feels wrong, anything at all, we leave immediately." Sarah nodded, though I could see her hands shaking as she tucked the photographs back into the envelope. "Promise me," she said. "Promise me that if we find something terrible, we'll still be okay, that we'll still be sisters, and we'll still love Dad, and our lives won't fall apart." I wanted to make that promise, wanted to assure her that some discoveries were survivable. But sitting outside Vincent Rousseau's house with a mysterious key in my pocket, I wasn't sure I believed it myself. Instead, I reached over and squeezed her hand. "Whatever we find," I said, "we face it together." Thunder rumbled in the distance as we stepped out into the night, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were crossing a threshold from which there would be no return. The basement key felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in my pocket, and with each step toward the darkened house, I wondered if some secrets were kept hidden for good reason. The basement entrance was exactly where I'd expected to find it. A set of concrete steps leading down to a weathered wooden door on the side of the house furthest from the street. Sarah and I crouched in the shadows cast by the overgrown hedges, listening for any sound from inside the house above us. The key turned in the lock with surprising ease, as if it had been used recently. "This is insane," Sarah whispered, but she followed me down the steps anyway, our phone flashlights cutting weak paths through the darkness ahead of us. The basement smelled like old concrete, and something else, something musty and organic that made my stomach turn. As our lights swept across the space, I realized we were in what appeared to be a finished basement, with paneled walls and a dropped ceiling that had probably been installed decades ago. But it was what covered those walls that made both of us freeze. Photographs, hundreds of them, pinned and taped and carefully arranged in a pattern that took up nearly every inch of available space. And they weren't just random family snapshots. These were surveillance photos taken from a distance with telephoto lenses, showing people who clearly had no idea they were being watched. "Jesus," Sarah breathed, her light dancing across the images. I recognized some of the faces immediately. Our grandmother, Patricia, in dozens of photos spanning what looked like several decades. Pictures of her grocery shopping, walking to church, working in her garden. But there were others too. Women I didn't recognize, captured in similar candid, invasive moments. "Look at this," Sarah said, her voice strange and tight. She was standing in front of a section of wall where the photographs were arranged more carefully, almost like a timeline. At the far left were images that looked like they'd been taken in the 1960s, judging by the clothing and cars visible in the backgrounds. As my eyes moved right, following the chronological progression, I realized I was looking at a visual record of someone's obsession. And at the center of it all was a corkboard covered with photographs of our father. Not recent photos. These looked like they'd been taken over the course of his entire life. There he was as a child, playing in what I recognized as our grandparents' backyard, as a teenager, walking to school, as a young man on his wedding day. Recent photos showed him going to work, mowing his lawn, picking up groceries. Someone had been watching our father his entire life. "Sarah," I said, my voice barely a whisper, "look at the dates." Each photograph had a small white sticker in the corner with a date written in careful block letters. The earliest ones were from 1964, the year after our father was born. The most recent was dated just 2 months ago. 60 years, Sarah said, and I could hear the horror in her voice. Someone has been stalking our family for 60 years. I moved closer to examine the photographs of our father more carefully, and that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In several of the more recent images, Sarah and I were visible in the background. Pictures taken at family barbecues, Christmas gatherings, our father's birthday parties. We had been watched too. "We need to get out of here," I said. But Sarah was already moving deeper into the basement, drawn by something else she'd seen. "There's more," she called softly. "There's a whole other room back here." Against every instinct screaming at me to run, I followed her toward the back of the basement. The second room was smaller, dominated by a large wooden desk covered with papers and what looked like genealogy charts. But it was the far wall that made me understand exactly how deep this obsession went. It was covered with newspaper clippings, all carefully preserved and organized chronologically. Headlines jumped out at me. "Local woman dies in house fire." "Family mourns loss of beloved grandmother." "Local man celebrates 40th wedding anniversary." Every significant event in our family's life for the past 60 years had been documented and catalogued by someone who was clearly not a family member. Sarah was standing frozen in front of the desk, staring down at something spread across its surface. When I joined her, I saw it was a detailed family tree, but not one created with love and nostalgia. This was clinical, analytical, with dates and locations, and what looked like medical information noted beside each name. At the top of the chart was a name I'd never heard before: Vincent Russo, B. 1940. Lines connected him to various family members, but the thickest, darkest line ran directly to our father's name. And beside our father's name, in red ink, were the words, "Biological son, confirmed 1987. "No," Sarah whispered, but the evidence was right there in front of us, documented with the obsessive care of someone who had spent decades piecing together the truth. I heard footsteps on the floor above us, slow, deliberate steps moving across what sounded like the kitchen. Someone was awake, someone was moving around, and we were trapped in their basement, surrounded by 60 years of evidence that our entire family history was a lie. Sarah grabbed my arm so hard it hurt. "The stairs," she breathed. The footsteps above us had stopped. In the terrible silence that followed, I could hear the faint creak of a door opening. And then, cutting through the darkness above us like a knife, came a voice I didn't recognize, but that somehow sounded familiar. An older man's voice, tired but alert. "I know you're down there. I've been waiting for you to come." The footsteps on the stairs were slow but steady, each creak of the old wood sounding like a countdown to something I wasn't sure I was ready to face. Sarah and I pressed ourselves against the far wall of the basement, our phone lights turned off, as if darkness could somehow protect us from whatever was coming. A light switched on at the top of the stairs, and I could see the shadow of a man beginning his descent. He wasn't hurrying. If anything, his pace was almost careful, considerate, as if he didn't want to frighten us any more than we already were. "My name is Vincent Russo," the voice called down to us, and I could hear a slight rasp that spoke of advanced age. "I knew your grandfather, Edwin Coleman, and I've been waiting 60 years to tell someone the truth about what happened to your grandmother." Sarah's hand found mine in the darkness, her fingers cold and trembling. Part of me wanted to run, to push past this man and flee back to our car and our normal lives. But a larger part, the part that had inherited Grandpa Edwin's stubborn curiosity, needed to hear what Vincent Russo had to say. He reached the bottom of the stairs and stood there for a moment, allowing his eyes to adjust to the dim basement lighting. In the weak glow from above, I could see he was indeed an elderly man, probably in his early 80s, with white hair and the kind of careful posture that suggested someone managing chronic pain. But his eyes were sharp, alert, and when they found us in the shadows, I saw something I hadn't expected: sadness, Deep, profound sadness that seemed to have been carried for decades. "You found the photographs," he said, not really a question. His gaze moved across the walls covered with images, and I saw him wince slightly, as if seeing his life's obsession through our eyes made him ashamed. "I suppose it looks terrible to you. Stalking, invasion of privacy, and you wouldn't be wrong." "Why?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Why have you been watching our family?" Vincent moved slowly to an old chair near the desk and lowered himself into it with obvious effort. "Because your father is my son," he said simply, "and because I've spent 60 years trying to protect him from the truth of how he came into this world." The words hit me like physical blows. Even though we'd suspected it, even though the evidence had been mounting, hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that photographs and genealogy charts couldn't. "That's impossible," I said, though the protest sounded weak even to my own ears. "Grandpa Edwin was our father's father. We have birth certificates, family photos, memories." "You have a carefully constructed lie," Vincent interrupted, but not unkindly. "Built by people who loved your father enough to protect him from something much worse than illegitimacy." He gestured to the wall of photographs showing our father through the decades. "I never tried to contact him directly, never tried to insert myself into his life. But I couldn't stay away completely. He was the only child I ever had, and I needed to know he was safe, that he was happy." Sarah stepped forward slightly, her curiosity overcoming her fear. "What happened? What was so terrible that it required 60 years of lies?" Vincent's face aged another decade before our eyes. He reached into a desk drawer and pulled out a manila folder, yellowed with age and worn from handling. "Your great-aunt Martha wasn't killed in an accident," he said. "She was murdered, and your grandmother, Patricia, she witnessed it." The basement seemed to grow colder as he spoke. I found myself thinking about the photograph we'd found in Grandpa's camera, about the terror in our grandmother's eyes and the shadow figure lurking behind her. "Martha was trying to help Patricia," Vincent continued. "Your grandmother had come to her in desperation, terrified of a man who had been forcing himself on her, a man who had made it clear that if she told anyone, there would be consequences." My stomach dropped as I began to understand what he was telling us. "You mean—" "I mean, your father was conceived through rape," Vincent said quietly. "And when Martha tried to help Patricia report it to the police, the man who attacked her decided to eliminate the witnesses." Sarah made a small sound, somewhere between a gasp and a sob. I felt my own knees go weak, and I had to lean against the wall to keep from falling. "But you were there," I managed to say. "In the photograph. You were in Martha's kitchen with our grandmother." Vincent nodded slowly, his eyes distant with memory. "I was Martha's neighbor. I'd been watching the house because Martha had asked me to. She was scared, said someone had been threatening her. When I saw Patricia arrive that night, obviously distressed and pregnant, I knew something was very wrong." He opened the manila folder and pulled out several more photographs, these ones clearer and more detailed than the one we'd found in Grandpa's camera. They showed the same kitchen, but from different angles, and in these images I could see Vincent more clearly, a young man in his early 20s, with dark hair and the same olive complexion our father had inherited. "I was trying to protect them," he continued, "but I was young, inexperienced. I didn't realize how dangerous the situation really was until it was too late." "Who was he?" Sarah asked. "The man who attacked Grandma." Vincent's expression darkened. "A police officer. Someone with power, someone who knew exactly how to hurt people and get away with it, someone who had been getting away with it for years." The implications crashed over me like a wave. If the rapist had been a police officer, then reporting the crime would have been not just useless, but potentially deadly. No wonder our grandmother had been so terrified. No wonder she'd turned to Martha for help instead of going through official channels. "What happened that night?" I asked, though part of me dreaded the answer. Vincent stood up slowly and moved to another section of the basement I hadn't noticed before. Behind a curtain was what appeared to be a dark room, complete with enlargers, chemical baths, and dozens of photographs hanging from lines to dry. I was taking pictures, he said. Documentation, evidence. I thought if we could prove what he'd done, if we had photographs showing Patricia's injuries, her distress, maybe we could find a way to make him pay. He pulled down one of the hanging photographs and handed it to me with shaking hands. It was a clearer image of our grandmother in Martha's kitchen, and now I could see what I'd missed before: bruises on her arms, a cut on her lip, the unmistakable signs of violence. But he found out we were gathering evidence, Vincent continued. He came to Martha's house that night and his voice broke, and for a moment he looked like the young man he'd been 60 years ago, overwhelmed by events beyond his control. He killed her, Sarah finished quietly. He made it look like an accident. A house fire, probably caused by faulty wiring. That was the official story. But I saw him leaving. I had photographs of him at the scene. Vincent moved to another drawer and pulled out images that made my blood run cold. A man in a police uniform, clearly identifiable, walking away from Martha's house just hours before it burst into flames. "Why didn't you take these to the authorities?" I asked. Vincent's laugh was bitter. He was the authorities. Detective Ray Morrison, decorated officer, pillar of the community. Who was going to believe a 23-year-old nobody with a camera over one of the city's finest? Morrison. The name rang a bell, and I found myself trying to remember where I'd heard it before. Family stories, maybe, or old newspaper articles. Besides, Vincent continued, Patricia begged me not to. She was terrified he'd come after her next, after the baby. She'd rather live with the secret than risk her child's life. So Grandpa Edwin, Sarah began. Stepped up, Vincent finished. He married Patricia, claimed the baby as his own, and they all agreed to never speak of what really happened. Edwin was a good man. He loved your grandmother, and he loved your father as if he were his own flesh and blood. I thought about Grandpa Edwin, about the man who had taught our father to fish and helped him with homework and walked him down the aisle at his wedding. In every way that mattered, he had been our father's real father. But you kept watching, I said, gesturing to the walls covered with surveillance photographs. All these years. Vincent's face crumpled slightly. I couldn't help myself. He was my biological son, the only family I had, and I was terrified that someday, somehow, Morrison or someone like him would figure out the truth and come after him. Is Morrison still alive? Sarah asked. Vincent shook his head. He died in 1987. Heart attack, according to the obituary, but by then, the pattern was established. I'd been watching for so long, documenting your father's life, making sure he was safe. I couldn't stop. The basement fell silent except for the sound of our breathing and the distant rumble of thunder as the storm moved away. I stared at the photographs covering the walls, at this shrine to a family that wasn't quite Vincent's, but that he'd protected from the shadows for 6 decades. Does our father know? I asked. About any of this? No, Vincent said firmly, and I hope he never has to. Edwin and Patricia did everything they could to make sure he grew up happy and secure, never doubting his place in the world. That was their gift to him. But as he spoke, I noticed his eyes darting toward another door at the far end of the basement, a door I hadn't seen before, partially hidden behind more hanging photographs. What's in there? Sarah asked, following my gaze. Vincent's face went pale. Nothing, he said too quickly. Just storage. Daddy. But something about his sudden nervousness made me suspicious. We'd come this far, uncovered this much truth. What could possibly be worse than what we'd already learned? I started walking toward the hidden door, and Vincent's voice rose in panic behind me. Don't, he said, please. Some secrets should stay buried. But it was too late. My hand was already on the doorknob, and as I turned it, I realized that everything we'd discovered so far had been just the beginning. Behind that door lay the real reason Vincent Russo had spent 60 years watching our family. The door opened onto a small room that had clearly been Vincent's most private space. Unlike the chaotic collection of surveillance photographs in the main basement, this room was organized with obsessive precision. The walls were covered with detailed maps, timelines, and what appeared to be police reports, photocopied and annotated in Vincent's careful handwriting. But it was the far wall that made me understand why he'd tried to stop us from entering. It was covered with photographs of Detective Ray Morrison, but not the ones Vincent had shown us earlier. These were crime scene photos, autopsy reports, and what looked like evidence from multiple cases spanning several decades. Morrison hadn't just attacked our grandmother, he'd been a serial predator, and Vincent had been tracking his crimes for 60 years. "Dear God," Sarah whispered, moving closer to examine the timeline Vincent had constructed. Names, dates, locations, dozens of women, maybe more, stretching back to the 1950s. "I couldn't prove what he did to Patricia," Vincent said from the doorway, his voice heavy with decades of guilt and frustration. "But I could document everything else. Every case that got buried, every report that disappeared, every woman who was too scared or too powerless to be believed." I found myself staring at a photograph of a young woman who couldn't have been more than 18, her face bruised and swollen, clutching what appeared to be a hospital gown. The date on the back was 1959, 4 years before our grandmother's attack. "This is why you've been watching our family," I said, the pieces finally falling into place. "You weren't just protecting our father from the truth about his conception. You were protecting him from the possibility that Morrison had other victims, other children, other secrets that might surface." Vincent nodded slowly. "Morrison was careful, but he wasn't perfect. I was terrified that someday someone else would put the pieces together, that they'd realize your father existed, that they'd come looking for answers or revenge." Sarah was examining what appeared to be a police report from 1962, her face growing paler with each line she read. "Vincent," she said quietly, "some of these cases, they were never solved. There are still people out there who don't know what happened to their daughters, their sisters." "I know," he said, and the weight of that knowledge seemed to bow his shoulders. "I've been carrying their stories for 60 years, and I've never known what to do with them. Morrison was protected by the system, by his fellow officers, by everyone who had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. I thought about all those families, all those women who had never received justice, whose attackers had been shielded by a badge and a network of complicity. The scope of it was overwhelming, horrifying in a way that our family's personal tragedy had been just one small part of something much larger. "But Morrison is dead," Sarah said. "Has been for almost 40 years. Why are you still collecting evidence?" Vincent was quiet for a long moment, and I saw him struggle with something internal, some final secret he was reluctant to reveal. Finally, he walked to a filing cabinet in the corner and pulled out a thick folder marked with a date from just 2 years ago. "Because Ray Morrison had a son," he said simply. "And Detective Kevin Morrison is currently working for the same police department his father did." The name hit me like a physical blow. Kevin Morrison. I'd seen that name in the local newspaper just last month. He'd been promoted to detective sergeant, praised for his work on several high-profile cases. The article had mentioned that he was following in his father's footsteps, carrying on a family tradition of law enforcement. "You think he knows?" Sarah asked. "I think he's exactly like his father," Vincent replied, opening the folder to reveal surveillance photographs that looked disturbingly familiar. Young women, photographed without their knowledge, their daily routines, documented with the same obsessive care Vincent had applied to our family. But these weren't Vincent's photographs. "I've been watching Kevin Morrison for the past 5 years," Vincent continued. "And I've seen enough to know that the apple didn't fall far from the tree. The only difference is that he's more careful, more sophisticated. He's learned from his father's mistakes. I stared at the evidence spread before us. Decades of crimes, generations of victims, a pattern of violence and cover-up that stretched across multiple decades. Our family's secret, devastating as it was, had been just one thread in a much larger, more horrifying tapestry. "What are we supposed to do with this?" I asked, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of what Vincent had uncovered. "How do we expose something this big?" Vincent looked at us both with eyes that held 60 years of helplessness and frustration. "I don't know," he admitted. "I've been asking myself that question for decades. I'm 83 years old, and I've spent my entire adult life collecting evidence of crimes I couldn't prove against men I couldn't touch." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, studying the timeline on the wall. Finally, she looked up at Vincent with an expression I'd seen before, the same determination that had driven us to this basement in the first place. "You couldn't touch them," she said, "but maybe we can." I knew what she was thinking. We weren't powerless young people in the 1960s, unable to challenge authority or make ourselves heard. We lived in a different world now. One where social media and investigative journalism and DNA evidence could sometimes overcome institutional protection and systemic corruption. "Our father doesn't have to know the details," I said slowly, thinking out loud. "But the other families, the ones who never got answers, they deserve to know what happened." Vincent was shaking his head. "It's too dangerous. Kevin Morrison is still active, still protected by the same system that protected his father. If you start asking questions, if you try to expose this, then we'll be careful," Sarah interrupted. "We'll be smart about it. But we can't just leave this buried forever." As if responding to her words, my phone buzzed with a text message. The sender was unknown, but the message made my blood run cold. "Stop digging where you don't belong. Some family secrets should stay buried." Vincent saw my expression change and immediately moved to look at my phone. When he read the message, his face went white. "How did they know?" Sarah whispered. Vincent was already moving, gathering up the most important documents and photographs with practiced efficiency. "The house is probably being watched," he said. "Has been for years. I've been careful, but bringing you here tonight..." Another text message appeared on my phone, this one with a photograph attached. It showed Sarah and me entering the basement, taken from across the street with a telephoto lens. "We need to leave," Vincent said urgently. "Now. And you need to decide how far you're willing to go to expose the truth. Because once Kevin Morrison knows you've seen this evidence, your lives will never be the same." Nanae, as we gathered up the most crucial documents and photographs, preparing to flee into the night, I realized that our search for family secrets had uncovered something far more dangerous than we'd ever imagined. The truth about our father's conception had been just the beginning. Now we were carrying the stories of dozens of victims, the evidence of crimes spanning decades, and the knowledge that somewhere out there, Detective Kevin Morrison was probably already planning how to make sure we never got the chance to tell those stories to anyone else. The basement that had held 60 years of secrets was about to become the starting point for a reckoning that was long overdue. But as we climbed those stairs toward an uncertain future, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking directly into the kind of danger that had already claimed too many lives. Some truths, I realized, came with a price that was measured not in comfort or ignorance, but in survival itself. The story continues beyond this moment, as Sarah and the narrator must decide whether to risk everything to expose generations of corruption and violence, or to protect themselves and their father by keeping silent about the evidence they've uncovered. Vincent Russo's 60-year vigil has ended, but the real fight for justice is just beginning.